you.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to be here. I was originally scheduled, I'm a social scientist, a psychologist. What I'm going to talk to you about has, I would say, nothing to do with medical innovation. I was originally scheduled in a different session, but it would have required me to give my talk at about 3 a.m. So the organizers kindly moved me to a more civilized time in my day. And so what I'm going to talk to you about is the balance between freedom and security, or the balance between efficiency and friction. And let me tell you what I mean. We worship collectively, we worship efficiency. We want to use less to get more. We want same-day delivery. We want to do more than one thing at a time. Efficiency is good, inefficiency is wasteful. That seems like a very reasonable, sound way to think about things. Economists teach us that increased efficiency is really the only way to improve our standard of living. I mean, think about it. If your company gives you a raise and doesn't become more efficient, the only way it can afford to pay you that raise is by raising its prices. And if that's true of every company and every employee, every time you get a raise, prices go up, then in effect, you're just running in place. It doesn't matter that you have higher wages if prices go up in order for you to get those higher wages. So if we're going to make material progress as societies, we have to become more and more efficient to make more with less and translate some of that efficiency into better compensation for our employees. This means streamlining supply chains, just-in-time delivery, minimal slack in the workforce. All of these innovations designed to increase efficiency. Achieve this and all of our lives get better and better, or at least that's what we're promised. If you're manufacturing cars, automobile manufacturers want to squeeze as many miles per gallon as they possibly can out of their car designs. That's what it means to produce efficient automobiles. Air resistance and friction, the grab of the road, are the enemies of efficiency. In the world of finance, it's mostly at the point of exchange where friction rises. Before money existed, going back a long time, the potato farmer had to bring sacks of potatoes to the marketplace to trade for eggs and milk. That's not very efficient, is it? With the invention of money, it was no longer necessary to bring sacks of potatoes. You could just bring money. And arguably, much that has happened in the financial world over the last 200 years can be seen as a continuation of this increase in efficiency of transactions, frictionless transactions. Credit, think about credit. Now you can go shopping for your eggs and your milk without even having the money. You just give the proprietor a piece of plastic, a credit card, and you pay for it later. And financial markets have taken this kind of efficiency to a whole other level. Each of these developments and many others have made it easier and easier to do your business without wasted time and energy, without friction. Each has made economic transactions quicker and more efficient, and that is obviously good. But one of the things we learned from the financial crisis a decade ago is that there can be too much of a good thing. One of the reasons why world financial institutions almost completely collapsed is that mortgages and other loans got transformed into tradable assets, into securities. And what that enabled bankers to do is to stop having to assess how creditworthy borrowers were. If you took a whole bunch of loans and put them together into a single tradable instrument, you could afford to have some people defaulting on their loans. And so all these people who work in banks and look at your credit You don't need them anymore. It doesn't matter what your credit is like. We just give you a loan, stack it with hundreds and hundreds of other loans, and these kinds of financial transactions get more efficient. This works fine until the bottom falls out. And when the bottom falls out and so many uncreditworthy people are getting credit, you have what was almost a worldwide financial collapse, which is what happened a decade ago. So what I want to suggest is that sometimes a little bit of friction that slows us down would enable both institutions like banks and individuals to make better financial decisions. So that, I think, is a lesson that we should have learned from the financial crisis of a decade ago. But we're facing it again, at least in my view, in connection with the COVID pandemic. The pandemic took the world by surprise and caught us up short. Why hadn't we stockpiled key supplies and machines? Why hadn't we built up hospital capacity? Why hadn't we assured that our supply chains were robust? One reason is that it would have been seen as inefficient to have stockpiles of masks and gowns and various other things that basically just sat in warehouses unused. Money spent on masks and gowns that are gathering dust in a warehouse could always be put to more productive use with other kinds of investments. And so we ran our healthcare establishments lean and mean, taking full advantage of our effort to be efficient, to have streamlined supply chains, just-in-time delivery, so that every asset we had could be put to productive use. And this, as it turned out, was a catastrophe. You know, it's not, you don't want to employ people you don't need to employ under ordinary circumstances, but then something like a pandemic happens and you don't have a single spare body to throw at the problem as hospital census keeps going up and up. And you realize that maybe having a few extra hands, being somewhat less efficient, would have enabled you to be prepared for and to respond to something like the pandemic. So efficiency is good, but too much efficiency means not enough resilience and not enough robustness in the face of an uncertain future. Psychologist Adam Grant and I published a paper about a decade ago suggesting that it's quite common for a certain amount of some feature to be good, but then more of it to be bad. Some motivation produces excellent performance. If people are too motivated, they choke. Performance gets worse. Some working together as a group produces cohesion and enhances productivity. Too much working together as a group and the group becomes stale. Some empathy allows you to understand what another person is going through, but too much empathy might prevent you from saying and doing hard things that need to be said and need to be done. And so there's a kind of sweet spot where these attributes that are good are in fact beneficial to us and to society, but as we get more and more of those benefits, they stop being benefits and they start being liabilities. I wrote a book about 15 years ago called The Paradox of Choice, and what I argued in that book is that freedom of choice is good. People want freedom of choice, people need freedom of choice, but there can be too much freedom of choice. When there are too many options available for people, what ends up happening is that people get paralyzed by all the options, not liberated by them. So again, freedom of choice needs a little bit of friction in order for people fully to benefit from having it. What we need is to find the right amount of empathy, the right amount of robustness, the right amount of resilience, the right amount of friction, and it's not easy to find the right amount. The English poet William Blake wrote 300 years ago in a poem called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. He suggested that perhaps the only way to figure out how much is enough is by experiencing too much. And what I want to suggest to you, what the financial crisis taught us 10 years ago, and what the pandemic has taught us now, is that efficiency is good, but we have now experienced too much. Seen in this way, efficiency is a little bit, inefficiency is a little bit like an insurance policy. Think about insurance. Every year that you don't get into a car accident and your house doesn't burn down and you don't need expensive medical care, you might think to yourself that you've wasted your money on automobile insurance and homeowners insurance and medical insurance, right? You just paid that money in and you derived no benefit. It was an inefficient use of your resources. We could be wearing that money or eating it or driving it instead of just sending checks for a benefit that we never use. And I think what friction does, what redundancy does, what robustness does, is it provides a kind of insurance policy so that disasters that it's almost impossible to anticipate, should they occur, we'll be better prepared for. One way to think about insurance is that however inefficient it might feel, is that it enables us to be resilient against the shocks that can befall us in a world that is radically uncertain. We pretend in this scientific age that we can attach probabilities to all possible future states of the world. That is an illusion. The world is radically uncertain. There's a new book written by two distinguished British economists, John Kay and Mervyn King, and they call it radical uncertainty. And what they argue is that most of the time, efforts to quantify risk by attaching probabilities to unlikely future states of the world are mostly science fiction, not science. What would anyone have said was the probability of a pandemic if asked in October of 2019? People might have come up with numbers, but those numbers would just have been, as I say, science fiction. The world is much messier than a roulette wheel or a pair of dice. So what should we do in the face of this radical uncertainty? I think instead of asking ourselves which option will give us the best results, we should be asking which option will give us a good enough result under the widest range of future states of the world. Instead of trying to maximize our returns on investments, we should instead be setting a financial goal and then choosing investments that will allow us to achieve that goal in the widest set of future financial circumstances. Instead of looking for the best job, we should be looking for a job that will be good enough, satisfying enough as coworkers and managers come and go, and as the future economy has its ups and downs. The term I've used to describe this attitude toward choosing, toward decision-making, is satisficing. Looking for good enough, and satisficing with an eye toward a radically uncertain future we might call robust satisficing. Satisficing is a form of insurance. Insurance against financial meltdowns, insurance against global pandemics, insurance against nasty bosses. Insurance can seem stodgy, right? It's like a man who wears a belt and suspenders. Perhaps we don't need both a belt and suspenders, but what happens if we have neither? And I think we have seen what happens if we have neither in most of the world's complete lack of preparedness for this pandemic. We would all like a car that gets 100 miles to a gallon. The forces of friction that slow us down are an expensive annoyance. When we're driving and we know where we're going and we're in control, fast feels good. But even here, A little bit of friction can forestall disaster when you encounter an icy road. Driving is perilous enough, and life is not nearly as predictable as driving. We don't always know where we're going. We're not always in control. A little something to slow us down in an uncertain world, in the uncertain world we inhabit, could be a lifesaver. Building friction into our lives as individuals and as a society is building resilience into the system. And it could be our insurance policy against catastrophe. And so to conclude, I think of friction as a commitment to worrying more about security and being willing to sacrifice a certain amount of freedom to do whatever we want in as efficient and smooth and easy a way as possible. We give up some of that freedom in exchange for which we have security, which is our insurance policy against unanticipated and often unanticipatable disasters. And so finding the balance between friction and efficiency, between security and freedom, is a challenge that we all face as individuals and as societies. Thank you very much for your time.